Jackson Thomas walked into the boutique with a sense of purpose. The city was alive, bustling with the promises of success. But here, among the expensive displays and glistening jewelry, the world felt still. It was quiet, almost too quiet. His eyes scanned the delicate fabric, the pristine displays of luxury, but something about it felt out of place. Perhaps it was the way the light reflected off the glass, creating an almost blinding beauty that felt more like a mask than a true reflection of life. He was here for a reason, a simple reason. A birthday gift for his sister, one that could match the warmth and elegance she carried with her. He was successful now, a young lawyer with more cases under his belt than many his age. Yet today wasn't about status or accomplishment. It was about the simple, quiet act of showing love. But as he moved deeper into the store, something felt off. The staff, though polite, seemed distant. The air, thick with judgment, felt colder than it should. Jackson wasn't sure what it was, but the looks were unmistakable. He had encountered this before. Subtle shifts in behavior, a tone that suddenly felt colder than before, eyes that spoke volumes without ever opening their mouths. His focus shifted to the item he had been eyeing. The price tag was high, but not unexpected. What happened next, however, would make him question everything. The cashier rang up the total, and the price was wrong, far higher than it should have been. Jackson's heart skipped. He had to be mistaken, but the doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. Could it be? The room around Jackson seemed to pulse with a quiet tension, the sleek surfaces reflecting light in a way that made everything feel distant. He wasn't new to wealth or the polished world of high-end boutiques, but something about today felt different. His fingers lightly brushed the fabric of the item he had selected, but his mind wasn't on the material. It was on the strange, creeping feeling that something wasn't right. As the clerk moved to ring up the total, Jackson's eyes lingered on the price tag for a moment longer than he intended. The numbers didn't quite match his expectations. He glanced again, almost unwilling to believe it. No, he had to be mistaken. It was an expensive store, sure, but this felt off, almost as though the price had been padded, adjusted in a way that made him uneasy. The sound of the register closing echoed louder than it should have, as though confirming his suspicion. The total was significantly more than he had anticipated. His fingers tightened around the receipt, his breath catching for just a moment. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince himself it was a mistake, but the unease continued to gnaw at him. His gaze shifted to the clerk. There was something in her eyes, something subtle. She didn't meet his eyes for long, and it made him wonder if he was being seen for the person he was, or the person they thought he was. Jackson's pulse quickened as he took another glance at the receipt, the numbers burning into his mind. There was no doubt about it now. The overcharge was deliberate, a subtle misstep woven into the transaction. Yet the true weight of the situation was heavier than he anticipated. As his fingers gripped the receipt tighter, a coldness settled in his chest. It wasn't just the extra cost that troubled him. It was the unmistakable feeling that something more sinister was at play. The store, with its pristine decor and polished ambiance, felt like a cage now. The luxury around him suddenly seemed suffocating, like an illusion woven to distract him from the truth. He couldn't ignore the way the clerk, her movements precise but stiff, had looked at him the moment he entered. It wasn't just the price that was wrong. It was the way he was being seen, the way she had assumed so much without a word. Her eyes lingered for a moment too long, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a look he knew all too well, a look that spoke volumes about who he was to her, not as a man, but as an outsider. Jackson wasn't one to back down, but the heaviness in his chest didn't dissipate. It was the quiet, invisible weight of the assumptions others placed on him. The kind of weight that couldn't be seen, only felt. A weight he knew all too well, no matter how many times he tried to outrun it. The air in the boutique seemed heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. Jackson stared at the glowing digits on the register, the numbers staring back at him like a challenge. The price was far more than it should have been. He could feel the heat rising to his cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, more unsettling. It was as though the world around him had tilted slightly, a quiet injustice slipping unnoticed into the everyday rhythm of life. His hand gripped the edge of the counter as he tried to steady himself. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, a calculated move that rested on assumptions made before he even walked through the door. Jackson could feel it now, creeping into his bones. He wasn't just being overcharged. He was being tested, subtly reminded of his place in this world. He looked at the clerk, who was now fumbling with the register, her hands shaky, almost as if she had sensed the growing storm in the air. The quiet hum of the boutique seemed deafening in that moment. She didn't meet his eyes, her gaze skimming over him, never truly seeing him, only what she presumed him to be. Jackson could feel the weight of the injustice settling in. It was more than just a price discrepancy. It was a reminder of the biases that ran beneath the surface, invisible to those who didn't want to see. The feeling gnawed at him, relentless and cold. The silence in the boutique thickened, as though time itself had slowed, waiting for something to break the tension. Jackson stood still, his mind racing through possibilities, each one darker than the last. His hand clenched around the receipt, the crinkling paper now a small but constant reminder of the weight he carried. His gaze never wavered from the total on the register. It haunted him, inescapable and glaring. Something wasn't right, and it had nothing to do with numbers. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm the whirlwind inside of him. The air around him seemed charged, as though the entire room was holding its breath. His instincts told him that the extra charges weren't just a mistake. They were deliberate. There was no reason for the price to be inflated so much. No logical reason, at least. He could feel the eyes of the clerk now, the subtle shift in her posture, the way she avoided his gaze as if afraid to face the questions in his eyes. The boutique, with all its sparkling decor, had suddenly become a cage. Jackson knew that beneath its polished exterior, the cracks were visible, cracks that spoke of something far more insidious. In that moment, something inside him snapped. The quiet calm of the boutique felt like a facade, and he wasn't going to let it remain. The truth was there, plain as day, and he was going to bring it to light, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone around him. The stillness in the boutique grew heavier with every passing second. Jackson could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle movement of the staff as they seemed to hold their breath. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, and even that felt like it was conspiring to add to the weight pressing down on him. He was certain now. The numbers, the silence, the way the clerk had looked at him. It was all connected. But it was more than just the overcharge. It was the quiet undercurrent of judgment, the invisible line drawn between him and the people who wandered through this glittering world without a second glance. His heart beat louder in his chest, but his expression remained unreadable. In this moment, Jackson felt the familiar sting of something deeper than frustration. It was something that, despite his success, had followed him throughout his life. Something that refused to be shaken off. The feeling of being seen only for what people thought he was, not who he truly was. Then, the sound of footsteps broke the tension. Jackson's gaze flickered toward the entrance of the back office, where Ryan Wilkes, the manager, emerged. His presence was almost magnetic, confident, and yet there was something in his eyes that was more calculating than welcoming. Ryan was polished, his suit sharp and his movements smooth. But Jackson wasn't fooled. Behind the surface, he could sense the underlying discomfort, the awareness that something was about to change. The boutique, once a realm of high-end elegance, now seemed like a stage for a much darker performance. The room seemed to shrink as Ryan's footsteps echoed on the polished floor, growing louder with each step. Jackson didn't need to be told who he was. The man's presence was enough to command the space, to make the boutique's cold elegance feel even more distant. Ryan's gaze flicked over Jackson, calculating, before he turned his attention to the register. His face held a mask of professionalism, but Jackson saw past it. He could feel the unease radiating from him, just beneath the surface. Ryan's eyes darted to the clerk, and for a brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them. Something silent, almost imperceptible. The air grew denser, the quiet tension a palpable thing that seemed to wrap around Jackson's chest, tightening with every second. He could feel the weight of the assumptions, the unspoken judgment that had lingered since the moment he walked in. It wasn't just the price. It was everything. Ryan's attempt to calm the situation felt hollow, a rehearsed gesture that did little to ease the storm building in Jackson's mind. Every glance, every shift in posture, only confirmed what he had suspected. This wasn't about an honest mistake. This was something deeper, something rooted in a system far larger than a miscalculation at a register. The boutique, the city, the world beyond, everything seemed to blur in that moment, leaving only Jackson's growing awareness. He wasn't just in a store anymore. He was standing in the heart of something far more insidious, and he couldn't ignore it. The boutique had grown quieter, more suffocating with each passing moment. Jackson's mind swirled with thoughts he couldn't shake. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by the glass and steel of the walls that surrounded him. He had entered this place seeking a gift, a simple token of affection for his sister. But now it felt like a battleground, a place where every action, every glance, was laden with weighty, invisible expectations. The polished floors reflected his every movement, reminding him of how out of place he suddenly felt. He had built his life with effort, with success, but here, in this space, it seemed to slip away. He could see the way the staff moved around him now, their steps calculated, their eyes momentarily flicking toward him before quickly shifting away. It wasn't the price that had unsettled him. It was the unmistakable sense of being perceived as something other than what he was, a nameless face in a sea of assumptions. Ryan stood near the front, his posture rigid, trying to maintain control of the atmosphere. But Jackson saw through it. The walls of the boutique, the gleaming counters, the cold elegance. It was all a performance. Behind it, something much darker stirred. Jackson couldn't quite name it, but he could feel it crawling under his skin. The unease, the quiet discomfort, had seeped into every corner, wrapping around him, slowly drawing him into its grip. The boutique's pristine exterior had crumbled in his eyes, revealing the tension and biases beneath the surface. And now, it was impossible to ignore. The boutique felt even colder now, though the air conditioning hummed steadily in the background. Jackson's senses were heightened, the pulse of tension in the air almost tangible. Every inch of the space, from the soft lighting to the carefully arranged displays, seemed designed to distract, to create an illusion of calm. But beneath the surface, everything felt off-kilter. The gleaming surfaces of the store seemed to reflect a world that no longer made sense. Jackson had always prided himself on seeing through facades, on understanding the silent codes that governed human behavior. Yet here, in this seemingly perfect environment, he felt exposed, raw. Every move he made was watched, analyzed, dissected. His presence, once unnoticed, now seemed to ripple through the polished veneer, breaking the illusion of perfection. The clerk at the counter moved with careful precision, her eyes not meeting his. Each small gesture felt deliberate, as if she were trying to maintain a distance, to create a barrier between them that was unspoken but undeniable. There was no denying the discomfort, the shift in the way people interacted with him. The weight of their gazes was unbearable, and yet no one spoke of it. It was the silence that screamed the loudest, the subtle distancing that hung heavy in the air. Jackson had walked into the boutique seeking something simple, a gesture of love, a gift. But now the very act of being here felt like a challenge. The boundaries that had once seemed so invisible were now glaringly apparent, and the discomfort that had settled into his bones was undeniable. The atmosphere grew thick, almost suffocating in its silence. Jackson's mind swirled with thoughts, each one sharper than the last. The boutique, with all its pristine displays and high-end allure, had become a stage for something far more uncomfortable than he had anticipated. It was as if the very air had become weighted, charged with an invisible tension. The quiet hum of the lighting, the faint rustle of fabric, everything felt like it was moving slower, as though it too were aware of the undercurrent of discomfort that flowed just beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took was being measured, scrutinized. The boutique, once an escape into a world of luxury, now seemed like a trap, its polished surfaces reflecting not beauty, but a subtle, biting hostility. The way the staff moved with precision, the way they glanced at him without really seeing him, it all built a wall of separation between him and this world he had briefly tried to belong to. Jackson's fingers tightened around the edges of his receipt, the paper crinkling beneath the pressure. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. A resolution, an apology, something to restore the balance that had been so casually disturbed. But all he was left with was the weight of something unspoken. The cost of the item, the overcharge, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the underlying message he had been sent, the one that told him, quietly, that he didn't belong. The store had transformed, revealing something far less inviting than its glamorous exterior. The boutique had taken on a new life in Jackson's eyes, one that felt sharper, more hostile. Every glossy surface seemed to hold a reflection of himself he didn't recognize. The elegance of the space, the high-end merchandise, all felt hollow now, like a facade that had been pulled away to reveal the stark, uncomfortable truth. The weight of it pressed on him, not physically, but emotionally. It wasn't the overcharge that haunted him anymore. It was the realization of how easily he had been reduced to nothing more than an assumption. The silence between him and the staff seemed to grow with each passing moment, stretching out like an endless distance. The tension was no longer subtle. It had taken root and was now a constant presence in the room. The look of discomfort in the clerk's eyes was now undeniable, and Jackson couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked through these doors, feeling the same undercurrent of judgment, the same quiet distancing. It was strange. Here he stood, surrounded by luxury, by things that were meant to symbolize status and success. Yet he had never felt so invisible. The boutique had promised an experience, but all it had delivered was a harsh reminder of the world's inability to see beyond the surface. He looked down at his hands, feeling a coldness creep into his bones. The truth, as it always did, was inescapable. The real cost was never the price on the tag. It was the invisible cost of being overlooked, of being reduced to a stereotype. Time moved slowly now. Each passing second stretched out, drawn thin by the invisible forces at play. Jackson's eyes scanned the boutique once more, but the polished displays, the soft lighting, and the immaculate arrangement of items seemed to mock him. The opulence he had admired earlier now felt suffocating. Everything about the space seemed crafted to distance him from reality, from what truly mattered. The sense of being an outsider grew with every heartbeat. It wasn't just the overpriced item. It was everything. The way the staff moved around him with careful, measured steps, as if calculating his every move. The air felt too still, too thick, each breath a little harder to take. Jackson had always prided himself on resilience, on standing firm no matter what came his way, but here, in this gilded cage, even he felt small. The truth had begun to settle in his chest, heavier than any price tag could be. It wasn't about the item he wanted to buy anymore. It was about the subtle yet undeniable feeling of being seen as less than. It was the price of his existence, measured by others who never bothered to understand, only to judge. His hands clenched around the receipt, the paper now a symbol of more than just a purchase. It was a reminder of the biases that lingered beneath the surface, hidden but never absent. Jackson took a deep breath, the weight of the world pressing down on him. But now it was clear. He wasn't just a customer. He was a reminder of what happens when people fail to truly see each other. The boutique was a far cry from the world Jackson had once known. Its high-end exterior, the gleaming shelves, and the whispered elegance, it had all seemed like a gateway into something better. But now, as the moments ticked on, it felt like a mirror to a world he could never truly enter. Each step he took echoed, sharp against the polished floor, as if even the space itself were trying to keep him at arm's length. Jackson's gaze shifted across the room, lingering on the other customers, those who moved effortlessly through the aisles, their actions unburdened, unaware of the weight he carried. The subtle shift in their body language was undeniable. They didn't see him as he was. Instead, they saw something else, something that didn't belong here. It wasn't the overcharge anymore. It wasn't the price tag. It was something deeper, a quiet rejection that stung far worse than any number could. The boutique felt colder now, the luxury around him almost oppressive in its inaccessibility. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the edges of his wallet. But the desire to buy something had vanished. What once seemed like an innocent transaction had shifted into something far more painful, a reminder that no matter how much he achieved, there were always walls built higher than he could climb. The truth hung in the air, thick and unavoidable. Jackson could no longer ignore it. In this space, with all its beauty and wealth, he felt like nothing more than a shadow, out of place, unwelcome, invisible. The boutique's walls closed in around him, the quiet hum of the lighting becoming louder, more insistent. Jackson's pulse quickened as the weight of the silence pressed against him, suffocating. He was no longer just an observer of this space. He was part of it now, trapped within its boundaries, unable to escape the quiet judgment that lingered like smoke in the air. Every corner he turned, every glance cast his way, seemed to carry an unspoken message. It wasn't the merchandise or the pristine displays that held his attention anymore. It was the way people moved around him, how they glanced at him with a quiet, almost imperceptible unease, before quickly looking away. The staff's measured movements, the polite but distant gestures, they all felt like signals, messages he couldn't ignore. Jackson had always been someone who saw through facades, who could navigate the world with ease. But here, in this carefully curated world, he felt as if the very ground beneath him was shifting. He could feel the weight of assumptions building, layer upon layer, until they were nearly suffocating him. He wasn't just the customer anymore. He was the outsider. The person who didn't belong. The one whose presence was a reminder of something unwanted. But still, he stayed. For reasons he couldn't fully understand, he lingered in this place, feeling more lost with each passing minute. It wasn't the overcharge. It wasn't the store. It was the realization that, despite everything he had achieved, some doors were always closed to him. And this, in its quiet, suffocating way, was one of them. Jackson stood still, his feet planted firmly on the cold, glossy floor of the boutique. The world around him had grown distant, like he was floating in some strange, parallel space. The soft chime of a doorbell, the faint rustle of fabric, even the distant murmur of a conversation. It all felt muffled, as though the sounds were reaching him from far away. He had been here for what felt like hours, but time seemed irrelevant now. Every movement, every glance, felt like part of a silent performance, an unwritten script where he was always the wrong character. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, heavier with each breath he took. The boutique, once a symbol of luxury and elegance, now felt like an elaborate stage set for a play in which he wasn't supposed to be. He couldn't remember why he had come here in the first place. A gift for his sister? Maybe. But now it seemed irrelevant. It wasn't about the store, the merchandise, or the overcharge. It was the quiet, invisible divide that had crept between him and this space, between him and the world he thought he understood. He had built his life on the foundation of resilience and achievement, but standing here, he felt small. The invisible walls that had always been there, just out of sight, were now glaringly real. And though he knew he could leave, walk away, it wasn't that simple anymore. The truth, harsh and unyielding, was now a part of him. The boutique's air seemed to thicken, each second stretching longer than the last. Jackson's body was still, but his mind raced. The space around him had transformed from a place of quiet luxury to a claustrophobic, oppressive atmosphere. His every step seemed to disturb the stillness, but even his movement felt disconnected, like he was a part of something he didn't quite understand. The walls, once gleaming and welcoming, now appeared distant and cold. The carefully arranged displays, meant to evoke desire, to suggest status, only served to highlight the distance between himself and the world they represented. It was as if he had been transported into a different reality, one where he wasn't meant to belong, one where his presence was merely an uncomfortable reminder of something that should be ignored. Jackson felt the tension coiling within him, the realization of his invisibility sinking deeper with every breath. The boutique, which had once promised to elevate him, had now become a prison, its beauty a barrier he couldn't break. The stairs that once seemed so subtle now weighed on him like 1,000 unseen hands, pressing down, suffocating. There was no escape, not in this space. No matter how much he shifted his stance, how much he tried to escape the moment, the truth of the situation remained. And yet, in the quiet, in the isolation he felt, something else began to stir, an understanding. The walls around him might have been built by others, but it was he who had allowed them to grow. The realization hit him slowly, the weight of it sinking deeper into his chest. The boutique, once a space of promise, had become a suffocating enclosure. Jackson's eyes drifted over the glossy surfaces, the carefully arranged shelves, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The allure of luxury, of high-end fashion, now seemed distant, irrelevant. Every corner of the store had transformed into a mirror reflecting his own internal struggle, the unspoken rift between himself and the world around him. His feet, once steady, now felt heavy with the weight of an unspoken truth. The longer he stood there, the more apparent it became. The world outside this boutique wasn't what he had imagined. It was a world that divided, that built barriers. Each item in the store, polished and pristine, seemed to scream of an unattainable perfection, a perfection that was never meant for him. He shifted slightly, the air in the room growing colder with each passing minute. The subtle tension between him and the space was now undeniable. The quiet buzz of activity around him, the soft shuffle of footsteps, all seemed distant, as though he were watching it all from behind a thick glass. Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of being an outsider, a mere shadow in a place that had promised to embrace him. But now, it felt like the more he tried to fit in, the more he was pushed away. The beauty of the boutique, the elegance of the display, all felt like a cruel joke. Something unattainable, a world that would never accept him, no matter how hard he tried. The boutique was no longer just a place to shop. To Jackson, it had become a test, a measure of how far he could stretch, how long he could withstand the silent forces pressing against him. Every inch of the polished floor beneath his feet felt heavier now, each step a reminder that he didn't belong. The gleaming lights above, once comforting in their warmth, now cast sharp shadows, creating a distance between him and everything he had hoped for. The displays that once caught his eye now seemed to mock him with their unattainable beauty. Perfect, pristine, and cold, just like the invisible barrier between him and the world he saw through the glass. Each carefully placed item, each smooth surface, felt like a challenge he would never overcome. It wasn't the price of the goods. It wasn't the overcharge anymore. It was the realization that no matter how much he reached for these things, they would always remain just out of his grasp. Jackson's fingers brushed lightly against the nearest display, feeling the smoothness of the glass. It wasn't the objects inside that caught his attention, but the sense of exclusion, the feeling that he could never truly be a part of this world. The longer he stood there, the more the weight of it sank in. The boutique wasn't just a store, it was a symbol of something far larger, a world where he could never be more than an outsider, no matter how hard he tried to fit in. Endless and suffocating. Jackson's footsteps seemed small against its towering shelves, the polished glass, the delicate items placed with such precision. Everything here was carefully crafted, curated, designed to inspire awe, but to him it all felt cold, distant. Each step he took, each breath he drew, seemed to stretch further away from the world outside. The walls, once shimmering with the promise of luxury, now pressed in, tight and unrelenting. As he moved further into the store, the feeling grew stronger, the sense of being invisible, of being a mere shadow in a world too bright, too pristine to acknowledge his presence. The hum of activity around him, the quiet whispers of staff, the soft shuffle of customers, it all seemed to blur together into a distant, unimportant noise. Jackson felt himself retreating within, his heart tightening with every passing second. The weight of judgment, silent but undeniable, wrapped itself around him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't the price tag that had brought him here. It was something more elusive, something deeper. It was the desperate desire to belong, to prove that he too could be part of something that seemed so out of reach. But now, with each passing moment, he realized the truth. He had never been meant to belong here. This space, this world, was built for someone else, someone who fit the perfect mold. And no matter how much he tried to bend himself to fit, he would never be more than an outsider. The boutique felt different now, as if the space itself had absorbed his unease. Each polished surface, each delicate arrangement seemed to mock him in its perfection, offering a reminder of the distance between him and the world he had once admired from afar. The elegant displays had become barriers, not doors. The luxury he had once longed for now seemed cold, distant, something he could never truly touch. Jackson stood still, his gaze drifting over the glistening merchandise. But none of it held his attention. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the weight of the moment and the suffocating realization that this world, with all its beauty and promise, had never been made for him. It wasn't the price of the items. It wasn't the overcharge anymore. It was the deeper, more painful truth that had begun to unravel within him. The truth that no matter how far he reached, this world would never truly open its doors to him. The weight of being an outsider hung heavily around his chest, a burden he could no longer ignore. The people who moved around him, the quiet hum of the store, felt distant, as if he were standing on the other side of a thick glass wall. The space was beautiful, yes, but it was also suffocating. The longer he stood there, the more it became clear. He was nothing more than a shadow in this world, a fleeting presence destined to fade into the background. The silence in the boutique had thickened, stretching to the very edges of Jackson's awareness. He could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing against his chest, each one more suffocating than the last. The space around him had turned from a mere store to something more, an arena where every step felt like a battle, every glance a judgment. The allure of luxury, the shimmer of perfect displays, no longer called to him. Instead, they stood as distant reminders of the world he would never fully belong to. Jackson's hand brushed against one of the glass shelves, the cold surface sending a shiver through him. For a moment, he simply stood there, lost in the stillness, letting the world around him fade into the background. There was no sound, no movement, just the faint hum of the air conditioning. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, yet in that quiet, something inside him stirred. An unfamiliar feeling, a realization that had been slowly building but was now undeniable. The store, once a symbol of everything he had wanted, now represented the walls he had built around himself. The invisible barriers he had spent his life trying to break down were the very ones that had kept him from moving forward. It wasn't the world that had shut him out. It was his own refusal to see beyond the surface, to accept the truth he had long ignored. And in that moment, standing in the heart of the boutique, Jackson finally understood. The world wasn't closed off to him. It had always been his own walls that had held him back. Jackson's feet felt rooted to the polished floor, as if the weight of his thoughts had anchored him in place. The boutique's gleaming surfaces, the perfectly arranged displays, once symbols of success and aspiration, now appeared distant, unreachable. Each step he had taken deeper into the store felt like a step further into his own mind, a place he had long avoided. He had come here looking for validation, for a sense of belonging, but instead, he was only met with the reflection of his own insecurities. The space around him was cold, silent, and yet the stillness pressed in with an intensity that was almost suffocating. The people who moved about the store, seemingly unaware of his presence, only served to highlight the isolation he felt. The gentle hum of the air conditioning, the soft shuffle of feet, were nothing but background noise, as distant as the world outside. It was as if time had slowed, leaving him alone with the reality he had long denied. Jackson's eyes moved over the shelves once more, but the items that once held his attention no longer seemed important. The bags, the shoes, the sparkling jewelry, they were just things, objects that represented a world he could never truly be a part of. He had spent his life chasing after these symbols, thinking they would bring him the peace he sought. But standing here now, he understood. It was never the things that would change his life. It was how he viewed himself. The boutique had become a maze, not of displays, but of thoughts that spiraled endlessly around Jackson's mind. The air around him, once filled with anticipation, now felt suffocating, each breath heavy with the weight of his own self-doubt. The glistening surfaces of the merchandise, once captivating in their perfection, now felt cold and distant, as if they were reminders of everything he couldn't grasp. Jackson's eyes lingered on a delicate necklace, a symbol of wealth, of success, but he didn't feel the usual pull towards it. Instead, he felt an overwhelming emptiness, a hollow space where desire used to be. For years, he had told himself that owning these things would make him feel complete, would grant him the acceptance he longed for. But now, standing in this beautiful, sterile place, he saw the truth for what it was. The things he had chased for so long were merely distractions, covering the deeper cracks within him. The store, with all its perfection, seemed to stand in sharp contrast to the chaos swirling inside him. The deeper he searched for meaning, the more elusive it became. No matter how perfect the world outside appeared, it would never erase the shadows within. The world would never fill the spaces he had neglected within himself. Jackson was beginning to realize that the path to belonging didn't lie in the things he sought, but in how he saw himself.